The moment I crossed the threshold of King County Superior Court, my daughter Sarah let out a nervous, fractured giggle, a sound that betrayed the cracked foundation of her confidence. My son-in-law, Braden Cole, just shook his head with the pity one reserves for a rusted piece of machinery that refuses to be thrown away. He adjusted his silk tie, looking at me like I was a rounding error in his perfect life. But then the Honorable Elena Rostova looked up from the bench. The color drained from her face instantly, leaving her looking as gray as the Seattle rain battering the windows. Her pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the mahogany, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. She wasn't staring at a frail, confused 72-year-old man. She was staring at a ghost from her days as a junior prosecutor. She whispered a name that hadn't been spoken in polite society for a decade. The auditor. My family thought they were putting a senile relic into a nursing home to rot. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded gun to the man who used to hunt billionaires for sport. It began, as these bankruptcies of the soul often do, with a toast I was meant to endure in silence. It was Thanksgiving dinner, hosted in Braden and Sarah's ultramodern glass box overlooking Puget Sound. I was seated at the far end of the table, separated from the power players by a centerpiece of imported orchids that cost more than my first car. Braden stood up, raising a glass of vintage Pinot to the ceiling. "To the future," he announced, his voice booming with the hollow charisma of a tech visionary running on fumes. "And to Ether Tower, the first crypto-backed vertical city in Seattle." He looked down the table at me, his eyes cold and calculating. "And to the past," he added, a smirk playing on his lips. "To the legacy hardware that served us well, but frankly, takes up too much bandwidth. Sometimes, you have to deprecate the old systems to free up resources for the new." Sarah laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound, signaling her allegiance. They were talking about me as if I were a server to be wiped, an asset that had fully depreciated and needed to be written off. "I am Arthur Vance. For 40 years, I was the lead forensic accountant for the SEC. I was the man they sent in when the books were cooked so well even the IRS was fooled. They didn't call me a hero, they called me the silencer, because when I walked into a boardroom, the screaming stopped and the handcuffs came out. But since my wife Eleanor passed, I had become invisible. I drove a 10-year-old Volvo. I wore cardigans. I listened more than I spoke. Braden and Sarah mistook my grief for senility and my silence for surrender. They looked at me and saw a resource to be mined, a checking account with a pulse. As Braden went on about his regulatory bridge loan and the minor liquidity issues he needed me to solve, I didn't say a word. I just sliced my turkey with surgical precision. They thought I was zoning out, lost in a fog of old age. They were wrong. I wasn't zoning out. I was auditing. And I had just found a discrepancy that was going to cost them everything. The dinner itself was a masterclass in superficiality, a performance designed to dazzle potential investors, but tonight, the only audience was me. The house was cold, a minimalist temple of concrete and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered no shelter from the relentless gray drizzle of the Pacific Northwest. It wasn't a home, it was a showroom for a life Braden couldn't afford. I watched my daughter, Sarah, across the expanse of the table. She was checking her watch every 3 minutes, her eyes darting toward her husband with a mixture of adoration and terrified obedience. She had lost so much weight since marrying him, her features sharpened by stress and the desperate need to fit into his curated aesthetic. Braden dominated the room, his voice filling every corner as he lectured on the inevitability of blockchain real estate, using words like paradigm shift and disruption to mask the lack of actual substance. I had seen men like Braden 1,000 times before. They were the peacocks of the financial world, all feathers and no flight. They confused debt with wealth and confidence with competence. I chewed my dry turkey and observed the telltale signs of a man on the brink, the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his third glass of wine, the way his eyes never truly focused on anything, constantly scanning the room for threats, and the fine sheen of sweat on his upper lip despite the aggressive air conditioning. He wasn't celebrating a victory, he was running from a collapse. When the plates were cleared by a catering staff that treated me with more respect than my own family, Braden made his move. "Arthur, let's step into the study. I have something to show you. Something big." It wasn't a request. He stood up without waiting for an answer, assuming the compliance of the elderly. I followed him down the long, echoey hallway to his sanctuary, a room lined with unread first editions and a massive interactive touchscreen desk that looked like it belonged on the bridge of a starship. He didn't offer me a seat. He tapped the screen, and a 3D rendering of a twisting, impossible skyscraper materialized, spinning in a digital void. "This is it, Arthur," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Ether Tower. We break ground in 3 months. Pre-sales are through the roof. The Saudis are circling. But, and here came the pivot, the moment the salesman reveals the hook, we hit a tiny snag with the zoning committee. Just bureaucratic red tape. I need to show a bit more liquidity on the balance sheet to get the final permit signed off by Monday." He turned to me, flashing a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "I know you have that conservative portfolio just sitting there, gathering dust. I need a bridge loan. $750,000. Just for 6 weeks. I'll pay you back with 10% interest. It's free money, Art." I looked at the spinning hologram, then I looked at him. $750,000, I repeated, my voice flat, devoid of the awe he expected. "For the zoning permit." I walked over to the window, watching the rain streak the glass. "That's an expensive permit, Braden. Even in Seattle. And if pre-sales are through the roof, why do you need my retirement money to show liquidity? Where are the deposits?" The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. I turned back to face him. "I don't lend money to black boxes, Braden. Show me the P&L, show me the escrow accounts where the pre-sale deposits are held. If the project is solid, the bank would give you that bridge loan against the land value in an hour. The fact that you're asking me, a retired civil servant, tells me the banks have already said no." Braden's smile vanished. It didn't fade, it was deleted, replaced by a flash of ugly, raw irritation. He took a step toward me, invading my personal space, using his height to intimidate. "You don't understand how modern finance works, Arthur. You're thinking in ledgers and paper receipts. This is crypto equity. It moves fast. If I wait for the banks, I lose the window. I'm trying to help you here. I'm trying to give you a win." "I don't need a win," I said quietly. "I need structural transparency. And until I see audited financials, the answer is no." The refusal hung in the air between us, solid and immovable. Braden stared at me, his face flushing a deep, blotchy red. For a second, I thought he might hit me. His fists clenched at his sides, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. Then, he laughed. It was a cold, incredulous sound. "Structural transparency," he mocked, spitting the words out. "You're unbelievable. You're sitting on a pile of cash, living like a pauper, and you won't lift a finger to help your own family because you're too busy playing detective. You know what, Arthur? Sarah was right." He leaned in close, his cologne overpowering the scent of old books. "You're losing it. You're paranoid. You think everyone is out to get you, but really, you're just confused. You can't grasp the complexity of what I'm doing, so you assume it's wrong. It's sad, really. We try to include you, We try to protect you, and this is the thanks we get." I saw Sarah standing in the doorway then, hovering like a specter. She had heard everything. She didn't step forward to defend me. She didn't tell her husband to back off. She just looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just a loan request. This was an ultimatum. I had refused to be their ATM, so now I was their liability. And liabilities, in Braden's world, were things to be liquidated. 2 days later, the rain had stopped, replaced by a brittle, cold gray sky that hung over Seattle like a dirty wool blanket. I was sitting in my breakfast nook, a modest alcove in the home Eleanor and I had bought 40 years ago. It wasn't a glass fortress like Braden's. It was a home of brick and cedar, paid off in 1998, with a garden that Eleanor had cultivated until her knees gave out. I was finishing the New York Times crossword puzzle, in pen, a habit I had maintained since my days at the SEC. It was my morning calibration, a way to ensure the gears of my mind were still meshing with precision. 17 across, a debt that cannot be recovered. 4 letters. Loss. I filled in the square just as the doorbell rang. It wasn't the hesitant ring of a neighbor returning a borrowed tool, nor the aggressive pounding of a solicitor. It was 2 sharp, professional raps. I checked my watch. 10 a.m. exactly. I walked to the door, my movement steady, my heart rate even. I opened it to find a young man in a rain-slicked windbreaker, holding a handheld scanner and a thick, rigid envelope. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at his device. "Arthur Vance?" he asked, his voice flat. "I am. Service of process. Sign here." I signed the digital pad with the tip of my finger. He shoved the envelope into my chest, turned on his heel, and walked back to an idling sedan without another word. I closed the door and weighed the package in my hand. It was heavy, dense with the weight of intent. I didn't open it immediately. I walked back to the kitchen, placed the envelope on the oak table where Sarah had done her homework as a child, and picked up my letter opener. I sliced the seal with a single, clean motion. Inside was a stack of documents, perhaps 50 pages thick, bound with a blue legal cover. I slid them out, the paper crisp and cool against my skin. The title page stared up at me in bold, uncompromising font, Superior Court of Washington, County of King. In re, the guardianship and conservatorship of Arthur J. Vance, an incapacitated person. Beneath that, the names of the petitioners, Braden Cole and Sarah Vance Cole. The air in the kitchen seemed to vanish, sucked out by the sheer gravity of the betrayal. I didn't gasp. I didn't shout. I simply pulled out a chair and sat down to read. I read it not as a father, but as the auditor. I read it for the facts, the discrepancies, and the narrative they were constructing. The petition was a masterpiece of fiction. It painted a portrait of a man I did not recognize, a confused, shuffling relic who was a danger to himself and his estate. Paragraph 4, Section B, the respondent, Mr. Vance, has exhibited a rapid and alarming cognitive decline over the past 6 months, consistent with early-onset dementia and Alzheimer's disease. I turned the page, my hand steady, though a cold knot was tightening in my stomach. Paragraph 7, Mr. Vance has demonstrated severe paranoia regarding his finances, refusing to engage in standard family investment planning and hoarding assets in low-yield accounts due to an irrational fear of modern banking systems. There it was. My refusal to give Braden $750,000 for a vaporware tower wasn't prudence. In their narrative, it was a symptom of mental illness. They had weaponized my caution. They claimed my refusal to be defrauded was proof that I needed to be controlled. The document went on to request an emergency ex parte order, asking the court to grant them immediate, temporary powers over my person and my estate to prevent waste and protect the respondent from financial predators. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. The predators were asking for the keys to the lock so they could save me from themselves. I flipped to the exhibits. Exhibit A, Declaration of Dr. Felix Thorne. I scanned the medical jargon. This Dr. Thorne, a man I had met exactly once for a 15-minute insurance physical Braden had insisted upon last week, claimed I was disoriented, unable to recall the date, and exhibited classic sundowning behaviors. He recommended immediate 24-hour supervision. I looked at the date on the declaration. It was signed 3 days ago. The day before Thanksgiving. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I set the papers down and looked out the window at Eleanor's dormant rose bushes. This wasn't a reaction to my refusal at dinner. You don't draft a 50-page petition, secure a medical affidavit, and file for a court hearing in 36 hours over a holiday weekend. This was a contingency plan. Braden had walked into that Thanksgiving dinner with this weapon already loaded and cocked in his pocket. The investment opportunity was a test. If I had written the check, they would have taken the money and left me alone for another 6 months. But because I said no, because I dared to ask for a profit and loss statement, they pulled the trigger. The betrayal of Braden was expected. The man was a shark in a suit that didn't fit. But Sarah. My eyes drifted back to the petitioner's line. Sarah Vance Cole. She had signed this. She had sat at my table, eaten the turkey I carved, and laughed at her husband's jokes, knowing that this document was sitting in a lawyer's office, waiting to strip me of my rights. She knew they were planning to declare me insane. She knew they were going to take my home, my independence, and the legacy her mother had built. And she had signed her name. I remembered her nervous giggle in the courtroom, the way she couldn't meet my eyes at dinner. It wasn't just fear of her husband, it was the guilt of an accomplice. She had traded her father for a quiet life with a man who viewed family as a renewable resource to be exploited. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the house wrapping around me. A younger man might have thrown a vase. A weaker man might have called his daughter, weeping, begging for an explanation, asking why. But I was neither young nor weak. I was Arthur Vance. I had spent 40 years dismantling frauds more sophisticated than Braden Cole. I pushed the papers away, clearing a space on the table. The grief I felt was profound, a heavy, suffocating weight in my chest, but I compartmentalized it. I took that pain and locked it in a mental drawer, the same way I used to lock away the stress of a federal indictment. I would mourn the loss of my daughter later. Right now, there was work to be done. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet. I didn't reach for a coat, I reached for the biometric safe bolted to the floor in the back corner. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. It chirped and swung open. Inside was not jewelry or gold, but a dedicated server hard drive and a laptop that hadn't connected to the public internet in 5 years. I took them out. I carried them to my study. I wasn't going to hire a family lawyer to argue that I was sane. That was a defensive move, and I was done playing defense. I was going to audit them. I was going to open their books, expose their rot, and I wasn't going to stop until the balance was zero. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the affidavit, Felix Thorne, MD. The ink was black, the loops of the letters tight and jagged, suggesting a hand that wasn't steady when it held the pen. The document was a damning piece of fiction, a medical death warrant for my autonomy. In it, Dr. Thorne claimed that during our consultation on November 21st, I had been unable to recall basic biographical data, disoriented to time and place, and agitated when questioned about financial matters. He diagnosed me with progressive cognitive decline with paranoid features and recommended an immediate transfer to a secure assisted living facility for my own safety. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking, but it was the sloppiness of the execution that offended my professional sensibilities. A good fraud requires a kernel of truth to ground it, but this was pure fabrication, a desperate narrative constructed by a man who clearly assumed I wouldn't have the mental faculties to read it, let alone dismantle it. They were banking on my silence, on the assumption that the shock of the accusation would break my spirit before I could mount a defense. They had forgotten that I didn't work in spirits, I worked in evidence. I let the paper fall to the desk and closed my eyes, summoning the memory of last Tuesday with the clarity of a 4K recording. Braden had insisted on driving me to this specialist, claiming he was a concierge doctor for the tech elite, a man who valued discretion and thoroughness. I had agreed, mostly to stop Braden's pestering, but also because a small, cynical part of me was curious about who my son-in-law considered a medical authority. We hadn't pulled up to a Glass and Steel Medical Center in South Lake Union. Instead, Braden's Tesla had navigated into a nondescript, low-rise medical park in Renton, tucked behind a strip mall that housed a vape shop and a struggling tax preparer. The waiting room of Thorne Integrative Medicine had smelled of stale coffee and industrial lemon cleaner, a scent designed to mask something older and mustier. There were no other patients, just a receptionist who looked bored and refused to make eye contact as she took my insurance card. Braden had been vibrating with nervous energy, tapping his foot against the linoleum, checking his phone every 30 seconds. "He's the best, Arthur," he had whispered, though I hadn't asked. "Real cutting-edge stuff. He sees all the Amazon VPs." When Dr. Thorne had finally called us back, he didn't look like a physician to the elite. He looked like a man who was intimately familiar with the bottom of a bottle. He was in his late 50s, with a complexion that was a map of broken capillaries and eyes that were watery and evasive. His white coat was dingy at the cuffs, and as he leaned in to listen to my heart, I caught the unmistakable, cloying scent of wintergreen mints fighting a losing battle against gin. The examination had been a farce. He hadn't asked me about my history, my diet, or my exercise routine. He had shone a light in my eyes for 2 seconds, tapped my knee with a reflex hammer, and then sat down at his computer, typing with 2 fingers. "Braden tells me you've been forgetting things, Arthur," he had said, not looking at me. "Getting confused about money. Thinking people are stealing from you." It wasn't a question, it was a prompt. I had looked at Braden, who was standing by the door like a prison guard. "I haven't forgotten anything, doctor," I had replied calmly. "And I don't think people are stealing from me. I know they are trying to." Thorne had exchanged a glance with Braden, a quick, conspiratorial flicker, and then nodded gravely. "Paranoia," he had muttered, typing the word into my file. That was the extent of the rigorous medical evaluation that was now being used to strip me of my civil rights. I opened my eyes, the memory solidifying into cold, hard data. Felix Thorne wasn't a specialist, he was a hired gun, and a cheap one at that. A doctor with a thriving practice and a reputation to protect doesn't sign a perjured affidavit for a man like Braden Cole unless he is desperate. And desperation leaves a paper trail. I turned to my computer, the machine I had retrieved from the safe. It was a customized rig, built to my specifications by an old contact at the bureau. It ran a proprietary operating system, stripped of bloatware and hardened against intrusion. I pressed the power button, and the fans whirred to life, a low, steady hum that sounded like a heavy weapon charging up. I wasn't logging into Google or Bing. I was logging into EagleEye, a legacy forensic data mining suite that could cross-reference public records, court filings, and financial disclosures across 50 states in seconds. It was the tool I had used to bring down the Enron subsidiaries, the tool that had earned me the nickname, the Silencer. I cracked my knuckles, a habit I hadn't indulged in years, and placed my hands on the mechanical keyboard. The tactile click of the keys was the only sound in the silent house. I started with the medical license board. Felix Gerald Thorne. The results populated the screen in a cascade of red flags. He wasn't a neurologist. He wasn't a geriatric specialist. He was a general practitioner who had been on probation twice in the last 5 years. The first citation was for overprescribing opioids. The second was for unprofessional conduct involving a patient, a euphemism that usually hid something far uglier. But the real gold was in the civil court records. Dr. Thorne was currently the defendant in 3 separate lawsuits for unpaid debts, a malpractice settlement he had stopped paying, a defaulted small business loan, and, most telling of all, a lawsuit from a gambling casino in Las Vegas for $45,000 in marked markers. The man was drowning. He was financially underwater, professionally compromised, and morally bankrupt. He was the perfect mark for Braden. My son-in-law hadn't found a doctor. He had found a fellow drowning victim and offered him a life raft made of my money. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating the dark oak of my study. A sense of cold, grim satisfaction settled over me. This was the mistake amateurs always made. They assumed that because they were lying, the rest of the world would be too polite to check. Braden thought he was playing 4D chess, but he had just moved a pawn directly into the line of fire of a rook. I printed Thorne's financial records, the disciplinary reports, and the docket numbers of his lawsuits. I organized them into a neat pile next to his fraudulent affidavit. The medical evidence against me was now my primary weapon against them. But I wasn't done. Thorne was just the instrument, Braden was the architect. And if Braden was desperate enough to bribe a doctor to imprison his father-in-law, his own financial situation must be catastrophic. I looked at the search bar blinking on my screen. I typed in Ether Tower LLC. It was time to see just how hollow the future of real estate really was. The auditor was officially on the clock, and I was going to bill them for every second. The digital trail between Braden Cole and Dr. Felix Thorne was not a highway, it was a muddy footpath stamped down by incompetence. I sat in the blue glow of my monitors, the hum of the hard drives the only sound in the room, and watched the connection materialize. A man like Thorne, drowning in 5-figure gambling debts and facing the revocation of his medical license, does not commit perjury for a promise. He operates on a cash-and-carry basis. Braden needed to move money to him, and he needed to do it quickly. I knew Braden's main accounts. I had set up his initial trust structures when he married Sarah, back when I still foolishly believed he was merely ambitious rather than predatory. I accessed the public ledger for BC Holdings LLC, a shell company Braden had formed 3 years ago, ostensibly for consulting. It was a lazy vehicle, the kind used by amateurs to hide lifestyle expenses as business deductions. I pulled the transaction history. There, buried between payments for a lease on a Porsche Cayenne and a membership at the Columbia Tower Club, was a wire transfer dated November 23rd. The recipient was Thorne Integrative Medicine. The amount was $30,000. The memo line read, with almost comical vagueness, medical consulting. $30,000. That was the price of my freedom. That was the market value Braden had assigned to my autonomy, my dignity, and the rest of my natural life. He had bought a diagnosis of dementia for the price of a mid-range sedan. I printed the transfer receipt, the paper sliding out of the machine with a soft hiss. I held it up to the light. This single sheet of paper was a felony. It was proof of conspiracy, bribery, and fraud. I could have walked into the district attorney's office the next morning and ended it. But the auditor in me hesitated. In my 40 years at the SEC, I had learned that the initial fraud is rarely the whole story. It is usually just the symptom of a systemic collapse. A man who bribes a doctor to lock up his father-in-law isn't just greedy, he is desperate. He is terrified. Braden wasn't trying to seize my assets to buy a bigger boat. He was trying to seize them because the water was already at his chin. If I struck now, I would get him on a single count of fraud. But if I waited, if I let him believe he had won, I would find the rest of the bodies buried in his ledger. I placed the document in my file, locked the safe, and powered down the servers. It was time to play the part they had written for me. The doorbell rang an hour later. It was Sarah. I checked the security camera feed on my phone before slipping it into my pocket. She was standing on the porch, holding a reusable grocery bag and looking over her shoulder as if she expected the house to bite her. I shuffled to the door, deliberately slowing my gait, letting my shoulders slump. I opened it and blinked at her, feigning a moment of recognition delay. "Sarah?" I asked, my voice pitched a little higher, a little more fragile than usual. Is it Tuesday?" She let out a breath she had been holding, her shoulders relaxing as she stepped inside. "It's Thursday, Dad," she said, her voice taking on that sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone people use for toddlers and the infirm. "I just wanted to check on you." Braden was worried. "You seemed so confused at Thanksgiving." She walked past me into the kitchen, setting the bag down on the counter. She started unpacking items I didn't need: organic kale, low-sodium broth, soft bread, performing the pantomime of the caring daughter while actively plotting to have me declared a non-person. I sat at the kitchen table, watching her. "I wasn't confused, Sarah," I lied, keeping my voice soft. I felt a bit overwhelmed. The noise. The talk about the tower. It's hard to keep up sometimes." She froze for a second, a carton of eggs in her hand, before turning to me with a sad, practiced smile. "I know, Dad. That's why we want to help. Braden and we've been talking. We think the house might be too much for you to manage alone. The stairs, the maintenance, it's a lot of stress." She was reciting the script. I could almost see the cue cards Braden had written for her. "We found a lovely place, Dad. It's a community. People your own age. Doctors right down the hall. You wouldn't have to worry about bills or groceries or anything." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her palm was cold, clammy with sweat. "It's called Serenity Gardens. We just want you to be safe." I looked at my daughter's hand covering mine. This was the hand I had held when she learned to walk. This was the hand I had held when she cried over her first heartbreak. Now, it was the hand that had signed a petition to erase me. The grief threatened to crack my facade, to bring the auditor roaring to the surface to confront her with the bank transfers and the lies. But I swallowed it. I looked at her with wide, watery eyes. I don't know, Sarah. This is my home. Your mother and I." I let the sentence trail off, knowing the mention of Eleanor would sting. It did. She flinched, pulling her hand away as if burned. "Mom would want you to be safe, Dad," she said sharply, her voice hardening. "She wouldn't want you living here alone, forgetting to pay bills, getting paranoid." She used the word Dr. Thorne had planted. "Braden says you were talking crazy talk about the tower. About escrow accounts. That's not like you." "I just worry," I mumbled, looking down at the table. "I have money saved. For you. For the grandkids. I don't want to lose it." Sarah's eyes lit up. It was a subtle shift, a dilation of the pupils, a quickening of the breath. "That's exactly why we need to do this," she said, leaning in. "Braden can protect that money, Dad. He's a financial genius. If you let him manage the estate, he can make sure it grows. He can secure the legacy. But if you keep it hidden and you get sick, it could all just disappear. There it was. The naked core of the scheme. It wasn't about my health, it was about securing the legacy before the ship went down. Maybe you're right, I whispered, defeated. I do feel tired. So tired. Sarah stood up, relief washing over her features. She checked her watch. I have to go, Dad. I have a meeting with the foundation board. She grabbed her purse, eager to leave the scene of her crime. Just rest. Don't worry about anything. We'll handle the paperwork. You just have to trust us. She kissed me on the forehead, a Judas kiss if there ever was one, and hurried out the door. I watched her get into her Range Rover and speed away. As soon as the taillights vanished around the bend, I straightened my back. The frailty evaporated. The confusion vanished. I walked back to my study and unlocked the safe. Sarah had mentioned a meeting with the foundation board. The Vance Literacy Fund. My wife's life's work. If Braden was bleeding cash, and he had already tapped his own shell companies, and he was coming for my estate, he wouldn't stop there. He would loot the burning building on his way out. I sat down at the computer and cracked my knuckles. It was time to audit the charity. The prospectus for Ether Tower was a glossy, high-definition hallucination. On the screen, it looked like the future, a twisting spire of glass and light piercing the Seattle clouds, powered by proprietary blockchain energy grids and sold via non-fungible property tokens. It was the kind of document designed to dazzle the tech-illiterate and the greedy, filled with buzzwords like synergy, decentralized asset management, and paradigm-shifting verticality. But I wasn't looking at the renderings, I was looking at the numbers buried in the footnotes of the footnotes. I was looking at the skeletal structure of the deal, and what I found was not a skyscraper, but a sinkhole. To the untrained eye, the balance sheet showed millions in projected assets and intellectual property valuation. To me, it showed a mathematical vacuum. The Ether coin that supposedly backed the equity had a trading volume of 0. It was a closed loop, a currency Braden had invented, minted, and then valued himself. He was effectively printing monopoly money, selling it to himself, and calling it revenue. It was a classic Ponzi structure dressed up in the costume of a tech unicorn, a fraud so transparent I was almost insulted he thought it would work. I cross-referenced the construction permits with the Seattle Department of Buildings database. The prospectus claimed they were breaking ground in 3 months, implying that the architectural plans were finalized and the zoning approved. The city records told a different, starker story. The lot at 404 Industrial Way was indeed owned by Ether Tower LLC, but there were no active building permits. There were, however, 3 active stop work orders for environmental violations and unpaid survey fees. I pulled up the satellite imagery. There was no fleet of excavators, no bustling crew of hard hats. There was just a waterlogged, fenced-off mud pit in a derelict industrial zone south of the stadium. A rusted shipping container sat in the middle of the lot, likely that the sales office Braden had expensed for $50,000. The disconnect between the glistening tower on the screen and the muddy reality on the ground was absolute. Braden wasn't building a building, he was building a myth. And myths, unlike skyscrapers, require a constant stream of fresh cash to keep from collapsing. The deeper I dug, the uglier the picture became. I traced the cash flow from the initial seed round, money raised from friends, family, and a few B-list venture capital firms. It hadn't gone into steel or concrete. It had gone into brand positioning, which meant leasing the glass mansion, the Porsche, the endless dinners at Canlis, and the tailored suits. Braden was burning capital at a rate that would make a government contractor blush. But the real horror wasn't a waste, it was the debt. A Ponzi scheme eventually runs out of new investors, and when that happens, the operator usually turns to lenders of last resort. I found the entry in a subledger for emergency liquidity. It was a loan for $8 million, secured against Braden's personal assets, including the house, his future earnings, and, crucially, his expected inheritance. The lender wasn't a bank. It was an entity called Vanguard Shadows Capital Partners. The name sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the drafty window. Vanguard Shadows wasn't a venture firm. They were predatory lenders who operated in the gray zone between high-risk finance and organized crime. They didn't sue you when you defaulted, they dismantled you. I hacked into Braden's email server using a password I had guessed on the second try, Bitcoin 2024, and found the correspondence with Vanguard. It wasn't polite. The subject lines were in all caps, immediate action required and final notice of default. I opened the most recent email, sent the morning after Thanksgiving. Mr. Cole, it read, the tone terrifyingly bureaucratic. Your grace period has expired. The bridge loan is now fully callable. Per the terms of your agreement, failure to remit the interest payment of $450,000 by December 1st will trigger the acceleration clause. We will move to seize all collateral, including the primary residence and the guarantor assets. We have initiated the preliminary skip trace on your family members. Do not make us send a representative to your home. The signature block belonged to a Marcus Sterling. I stared at the screen. December 1st was tomorrow. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with the force of a closing prison door. Braden wasn't just greedy. He was terrified. He was a man standing on a trapdoor with a noose around his neck, and the lever was about to be pulled. The conservatorship, the rush to declare me incompetent, the sudden need for control over my estate, it wasn't about investment strategy. It was a desperate, frantic attempt to access my liquid assets to pay the vicarage to Vanguard Shadows. He needed my retirement fund to keep the wolves from the door for another month. He was willing to imprison his own father-in-law, to drug me with antipsychotics in a cheap nursing home, just to buy himself 30 more days of pretending to be a billionaire. It was a betrayal born of pure, unadulterated panic. And Sarah? Did she know? I looked at the emails again. There was a forwarded message to her, with the subject line, "Everything is under control, trust me." She might not know the extent of the rot, but she knew they were drowning. She had chosen to believe the lie because the truth was too expensive. I sat back, the light from the screen reflecting in my glasses. A strange calm settled over me. When you understand the motive, the enemy becomes less frightening and more pathetic. Braden Cole wasn't a monster, he was a cornered rat. And rats are dangerous, but they are also predictable. He had exposed his flank. He had leveraged everything he owned to a predator more dangerous than himself. But he had made one fatal calculation error. He had assumed that Vanguard Shadows was the biggest shark in the water. He didn't know that he was swimming with the megalodon. I knew Marcus Sterling. I knew him back when he was a 22-year-old junior analyst caught up in the dot-com bust, a kid I had spared from a federal indictment because I saw he was just following orders. I had given him a second chance, and he had used it to build a terrifying empire of shadow equity. I picked up my encrypted phone. It was time to call in a 20-year-old favor. It was time to buy the debt. The Vance Literacy Fund was not just a charity, it was a shrine. Eleanor had founded it 20 years ago with the settlement money from a car accident that had nearly taken her leg, turning her own pain into a pathway for underprivileged children in King County to learn to read. She had spent her final years curating book drives, organizing reading circles, and meticulously managing the endowment to ensure it would outlive us both. It was a sacred trust, a firewall between the cynical world of finance I inhabited and the pure, altruistic goodness she represented. I had given Sarah the directorship as a way to keep her mother's spirit alive, a torch to carry. I assumed, with the naive blindness of a father, that the sanctity of the mission would protect it from the rot infecting the rest of her life. I assumed that no matter how desperate Braden became, there were lines that even he, and certainly Sarah, would not cross. I was wrong. The moment I logged into the fund's secure banking portal, the screen refreshed, and the illusion of my daughter's morality shattered into 1,000 irreparable shards. The account balance, which should have been comfortably sitting in the mid-six figures, blinked back at me in stark, accusatory red, $4,320.18. I stared at the number, waiting for it to correct itself, for a digit to be missing, for a glitch in the server. But the number remained, a digital tombstone marking the death of Eleanor's legacy. My hands, usually so steady on a keyboard, trembled as I clicked on the transaction history. The bleeding hadn't been slow, it had been a hemorrhage. Starting 6 months ago, the withdrawals began. They weren't small, subtle siphons for expenses. They were massive, jagged chunks of capital torn from the principal. $50,000 to BC Holdings LLC for strategic consulting, $75,000 to Ether Development Group for venue rental deposits, $35,000 to Serenity Spa and Wellness for board retreats. They had treated a charity for illiterate children like a personal piggy bank. They had looted the endowment meant to buy textbooks and fund tutors to pay for Braden's failing business and Sarah's stress relief. I felt a physical pain in my chest, a dull, crushing ache that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with my soul. But the auditor in me forced me to push past the horror. I needed to know the mechanism of the theft. I needed to know who held the pin. In a charitable trust, transfers of this magnitude require dual authorization, or at least the signature of the managing director. I clicked on the hyperlink for the largest check, a transfer of $80,000 to Braden's shell company, dated just 3 weeks ago. The digital image of the check popped up on the screen, high resolution and undeniable. I zoomed in on the signature line. I wanted it to be Braden's jagged scrawl. I wanted it to be a clumsy forgery, a sign that he had stolen this money behind her back. But it wasn't. The signature was elegant, looped, and painfully familiar. Sarah Vance Cole. She hadn't just looked away while he robbed the house, she had unlocked the door and held the sack open for him. I slumped back in my chair, the air leaving my lungs. I remembered the day Eleanor died. Sarah had sat by her bedside, holding her hand, promising to keep the literacy fund alive, promising to make her proud. And now, she was signing checks to fund her husband's Ponzi scheme with money meant for the memory of the woman she had wept for. This wasn't just embezzlement, it was desecration. It was a betrayal so profound it severed the biological tether between us. I thought of her earlier visit, her feigned concern for my confusion, her plea for me to hand over my estate to secure the legacy. She wasn't trying to protect the money. She was trying to replenish the pot she had already emptied. She needed my assets not just to pay off Braden's debts, but to hide her own crimes before the annual tax audit exposed the looting. She was terrified, yes, but her fear had curdled into malice. For 10 minutes, I sat in the dark, and I wept. I cried for the little girl who used to ride on my shoulders. I cried for the woman who had lost her way. I cried for Eleanor, thankful that she wasn't here to see what her daughter had become. But as the tears dried, something else took their place. A coldness. A rigidity. It was the feeling of steel hardening in the forge. I took off my glasses and wiped them with my handkerchief. I put them back on and looked at the screen. The father in me had just died in that chair, killed by the signature on a stolen check. The man who stood up was purely the auditor. In my line of work, We have a saying, intent turns a mistake into a crime. Sarah hadn't made a mistake. She had made a choice. She had chosen her husband's lies over her mother's truth. She had chosen theft over integrity. And now, she would face the audit. I printed every check, every bank statement, every fraudulent invoice. I built a file for Sarah that sat next to the file for Braden. They were a matching set, partners in crime as well as marriage. I picked up the phone again. I had the evidence of the fraud, the motive for the conservatorship, and the proof of their insolvency. But to truly end this, to make sure they could never hurt anyone again, I needed to control the battlefield. I needed to hold the one thing Braden feared more than prison, his debt. I dialed the number for Marcus Sterling at Vanguard Shadows. It was late, but men like Marcus didn't sleep, they waited. He answered on the second ring. Arthur Vance, his voice rasped, sounding like gravel in a blender. I haven't seen that name on my caller ID in 20 years. To what do I owe the pleasure? Or should I be calling my lawyer? No lawyer, Marcus, I said, my voice flat and devoid of the grief that had just racked my body. I'm calling with a business proposition. You hold a note on a man named Braden Cole. Ether Tower LLC. About $8 million. There was a pause, a beat of silence where I could hear him assessing the situation. I do, Marcus replied, his tone shifting from wary to curious. He's in default. We're moving to liquidate him tomorrow. Why? Is he a friend of yours? He's my son-in-law, I said. And I want to buy the debt. Marcus laughed, a dry, barking sound. You want to pay off his loan. Arthur, you're a soft touch. The kid is a loser. You're throwing good money after bad. Let me break his legs, it's cheaper. I don't want to pay it off, Marcus, I corrected him, the ice in my voice dropping the temperature of the room. I want to buy it. I want the paper. I want the assignment of the lien. I want to be the one holding the note when the clock strikes 12. The silence on the other end was longer this time. Marcus Sterling was a predator, but he respected a fellow hunter. He understood instantly what I was asking. I wasn't saving Braden. I was buying the right to be his executioner. I see, Marcus said softly. You want to be the bank. I want to be the foreclosure, I said. Send me the wire instructions. I'll transfer the full principal and interest from my offshore trust tonight. But I want the assignment documents in my inbox by 8 a.m. And Marcus? Not a word to Braden. As far as he knows, you're still the wolf at the door. Done, Marcus said. Pleasure doing business with you, auditor. Remind me never to piss you off. I hung up the phone. The transaction was set. By tomorrow morning, I would own Braden's house, his car, his company, and his freedom. I looked at the picture of Eleanor on my desk. I'm sorry, Elle, I whispered to the silence. I can't save her. But I can make sure the books balance. The transfer of $8,450,000 is a quiet affair. In the movies, transactions of this magnitude are accompanied by dramatic music and tension-filled progress bars, but in the sterile reality of high-level finance, it is simply a click. I sat in the pre-dawn silence of my study, the blue light of the monitor painting my face in ghostly hues, and authorized the wire from my offshore trust to Vanguard Shadows Capital Partners. This was the majority of my liquid net worth, the accumulation of 40 years of government service, shrewd market investments, and a lifetime of frugality. I was emptying my war chest to buy a sinking ship, a financial move that any sane advisor would call suicidal. But I wasn't investing in real estate, and I wasn't looking for a return on capital. I was investing in justice. I was buying the sword that hung over my son-in-law's head so that I could be the one to swing it. The confirmation email from Marcus Sterling arrived 3 minutes later, attached with a heavy PDF file titled Assignment of Note and Deed of Trust. I opened it, my eyes scanning the dense legal boilerplate with the familiarity of a man who used to draft these indictments. It was all there. The original promissory note signed by Braden Cole. The personal guarantee pledging his unshakable faith in a Ponzi scheme. The cross-collateralization clauses that tied his glass mansion, his luxury cars, and his future earnings to the debt. And finally, the assignment clause, transferring all rights, title, and interest from Vanguard Shadows to the Eleanor Trust, a holding entity I controlled. I scrolled to the bottom, where Marcus's digital signature sat next to the timestamp. It was done. Legally, Braden Cole no longer owed money to a faceless hedge fund. He owed every cent, every breath, and every lie to me. I printed the document, the hum of the printer sounding like the revving of an engine. I placed it in a fresh manila folder, distinct from the others. This wasn't evidence of a crime, it was the instrument of punishment. With the sun just beginning to bruise the gray Seattle sky, I went upstairs to prepare for court. I bypassed the row of beige cardigans and corduroys that had been my uniform of invisibility for the last decade. I walked to the back of the closet, pushing aside the mothballed memories, and pulled out the garment bag I hadn't touched since my retirement party. Inside was a charcoal gray, 3-piece suit, tailored on Savile Row during a consulting trip to London in the late 90s. It was a suit designed for boardrooms and federal hearings, a suit that commanded silence. I put it on. The fabric was cool and heavy, a stark contrast to the soft, forgiving wool I had worn as a grieving widower. I tied my tie with a double Windsor knot, tight and symmetrical. I looked in a mirror. The sad, confused old man who shuffled through grocery stores was gone. Staring back at me was the auditor. My eyes were clear, cold, and predatory. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a foreclosure. I met David Gentry at a diner near the courthouse at 7:30 a.m. David was my former deputy chief at the SEC, a man who argued cases with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He was now in private practice, charging $1,000 an hour to defend the kind of people we used to prosecute, but for me, he was working pro bono. He claimed it was for old time's sake, but I knew the truth. He missed the hunt. He was reading the file I had sent him, shaking his head over a plate of untouched eggs. "Arthur," he said, not looking up. "This is thorough. You have the medical records, the financial forensic trace on the charity, the shell company bank statements. We can get the conservatorship thrown out in 10 minutes. We can have the doctor arrested by lunch." He looked up then, his eyes narrowing as he took in my suit. "But you didn't call me here just to play defense, did you? You look like you're about to invade a country." I slid the new manila folder across the table. "I don't want the petition thrown out, David. Not yet. I want them to make their case. I want them to testify under oath." David opened the folder, his eyes widening as he read the assignment of note. He whistled, a low, impressed sound. "You bought the debt," he whispered. "You bought the whole damn thing. $8 million. Arthur, if the underlying asset is garbage, and you say this tower is a mud pit, you're eating this loss. You're lighting $8 million on fire just to burn him." He looked at me with a mixture of horror and awe. "Why? We could send him to prison with just the embezzlement charges." "Prison is too abstract for Braden," I said, sipping my black coffee. "He thinks he can talk his way out of a cell. He thinks he can charm a jury. But debt? Debt is binary. Debt is absolute. I don't want him just to go to jail, David. I want him to know that he lost. I want him to understand that the legacy hardware he mocked didn't just malfunction, it recalculated his entire existence and found it insolvent. I leaned forward. Besides, Sarah is involved. If I just file criminal charges, she becomes a co-defendant immediately. I need to break them apart. I need Braden to turn on her, or her to turn on him. Pressure does that. And there is no pressure like total, immediate bankruptcy. David closed the folder and smiled, a sharp, shark-like grin. You haven't changed a bit, have you? The silencer. He checked his watch. Court starts in an hour. Judge Rostova is presiding. Elena? I asked. I haven't seen her since she was a junior prosecutor. She remembers you, David said, standing up and throwing a 20 on the table. Everyone remembers you, Arthur. That's what Braden and Sarah forgot. They thought they were burying a grandfather. They didn't check the file to see who that grandfather used to be. We walked out of the diner and into the rain. The courthouse loomed ahead, a brutalist concrete fortress where lives were dismantled on paper. Braden and Sarah would be there already, rehearsing their lies, practicing their sad faces, convinced they were walking into a formality. They thought they were about to take control of a senile old man's fortune. They had no idea they were walking into an audit. And the books were about to close. King County Superior Court is a brutalist cathedral of gray stone and fluorescent lighting, a place designed to make you feel small before the machinery of the state. To most people, the air here smells of anxiety, stale coffee, and impending ruin. To me, it smells like work. As David Gentry and I walked through the security checkpoint, the metal detectors buzzing rhythmically, I felt a familiar calmness settle over me. This was my ecosystem. For 40 years, I had lived in rooms just like this, translating complex financial crimes into prison sentences. I adjusted my cuffs, the charcoal wool of my suit absorbing the harsh overhead light, and glanced at David. He wasn't carrying a briefcase, he was carrying a single, slim file folder. He looked less like a lawyer and more like a demolition expert walking toward a condemned building. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We took the elevator to the 4th floor, the doors sliding open to reveal a hallway crowded with the desperate and the hopeful. And there, standing near the double doors of courtroom 4B, were the architects of my destruction. Braden and Sarah were huddled together, a portrait of staged concern. Braden was wearing a navy suit that shouted its price tag, his hair gelled into a helmet of aggressive success. He was whispering furiously into his phone, likely checking the price of the cryptocurrency that was currently vaporizing his net worth. Sarah stood beside him, looking pale and diminished. She was wearing a modest black dress, the kind one wears to a funeral, or in this case, a competency hearing where you plan to bury your father alive. She was twisting her wedding ring, a nervous tic I hadn't seen since she was a teenager caught sneaking out. Standing with them was their lawyer, a man I recognized from the society pages rather than the law journals. Miles Fletcher was a fixer for the South Lake Union crowd, a man who specialized in making DUIs and harassment suits disappear with a smile and a check. He looked confident, checking his reflection in the glass of the courtroom door, oblivious to the fact that he was about to step into a cage with a tiger. When they finally saw me, the reaction was visceral. Sarah let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared at my suit, at my posture, at the clear, sharp intelligence in my eyes. She had expected the cardigan-wearing, shuffling old man she had successfully gaslit for the last 6 months. She hadn't expected the return of the man who used to terrify her high school boyfriends with a single glance. Braden, however, was slower to process the threat. He looked me up and down, a sneer curling his lip. He shook his head, a gesture of profound, pitying contempt. He walked over, invading my personal space, carrying the scent of expensive musk and desperation. "Arthur," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I see you dressed up. That's nice. But you didn't have to hire a lawyer. We're just going to talk to the judge. It's for your own good. We're trying to help you." He glanced at David, dismissing him as a public defender. "Don't drag this out, Art. It's embarrassing enough as it is." "I agree, Braden," I said, my voice smooth and cool, like polished stone. "It is going to be embarrassing." I didn't step back. I didn't blink. I held his gaze until he flinched, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He pulled back, confused by the lack of fear, but his arrogance quickly filled the gap. He turned his back on me and ushered Sarah into the courtroom. We followed. The room was standard issue, wood paneling, uncomfortable benches, the great seal of the state of Washington hanging behind the bench. Braden and Sarah took their seats at the petitioner's table, arranging their papers with theatrical importance. Fletcher leaned over and whispered something that made Braden chuckle. They were relaxed. They believed the narrative was set, a sad, senile old man versus a loving, successful young couple. They had the doctor's note. They had the story. They had no idea that the story was about to change genres. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, his voice bouncing off the acoustic tiles. We stood. The door behind the bench opened, and the Honorable Elena Rostova swept into the room. She was a woman of 60, with steel gray hair pulled back into a severe bun and eyes that had seen every variation of human folly. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had a full docket and zero patience for nonsense. She sat down, the leather chair groaning, and put on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses. She picked up the file on top of the stack, her face a mask of bored bureaucracy. "Good morning," she intoned, her voice flat. "Case number 894, B. In the matter of the guardianship of Arthur J. Vance." She read the name mechanically, her mind likely already moving to the lunch break. Then, procedure dictated she identify the parties. She looked at the petitioners. "Counselor Fletcher, I see you are representing the family." Fletcher stood and bowed, a preening gesture. "Yes, Your Honor." "A tragic case, truly." Judge Rostova nodded, uninterested. Then she turned her gaze to the respondent's table. "And the respondent, Mr. Vance, is he present?" She looked over the rim of her glasses. She looked right at me. The air left the room instantly. The judge didn't just pause, she froze. Her face, which had been a mask of tired indifference, went white. Her eyes widened, magnified by her lenses, and her mouth opened slightly in shock. The pen she was holding slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. She wasn't looking at a frail, confused senior citizen. She was looking at the man who had mentored her when she was a green assistant U.S. attorney. She was looking at the man who had taught her how to follow the money through a labyrinth of shell companies in the Caymans. She whispered one name, a name that carried the weight of a decade of federal convictions. The auditor. It was barely audible, but in the dead silence, it sounded like a scream. Braden and Sarah were staring at her, confused. Fletcher looked annoyed by the interruption to his performance. "Your Honor," Fletcher asked, stepping forward. "Is something wrong?" "The respondent is unwell. As you can see from the medical exhibits, his cognitive decline is severe." Judge Rostova tore her eyes away from me and looked at Fletcher. The shock on her face was replaced by a look of profound, terrifying incredulity. She let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh if it weren't so devoid of humor. "Cognitive decline," she repeated, her voice rising. "Counselor, do you have any idea who is sitting at that table?" Fletcher blinked, caught off guard. He is Arthur Vance, a retired civil servant. A retired civil servant, the judge repeated, leaning forward. Mr. Fletcher, the man sitting at that table is the former lead forensic accountant for the Securities and Exchange Commission. He is the man who dismantled the Enigma protocols. He is the man who wrote the manual on asset tracing that is currently used by the FBI. She pointed a shaking finger at me. That is Arthur Vance, the auditor. And you are telling me he has forgotten how to manage his checkbook? The color drained from Braden's face. He looked at me, then at the judge, the realization slowly dawning that he had walked into a trap. Sarah shrank into her seat, making herself as small as possible. Judge Rostova turned back to me, her expression softening into a mixture of respect and deep curiosity. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice regaining its judicial authority but holding a note of warmth. It has been a long time. I assume you are here to contest this petition. I stood up. I didn't lean on the table. I didn't waver. Good morning, Your Honor, I said, my voice filling the room without effort. I am not just here to contest the petition. I am here to correct the record. I gestured to David, who stood up beside me. And I am here to submit a counter-filing regarding the criminal conduct of the petitioners. Fletcher sputtered. Criminal conduct. Objection. This is a guardianship hearing. Judge Rostova slammed her gavel down, the sound cracking like a whip. Sit down, Mr. Fletcher, she roared. You have brought a lion into my courtroom and tried to tell me it's a house cat. If Mr. Vance says there is criminal conduct, this court will hear it. Proceed. Braden looked at his lawyer, panic flaring in his eyes. The script was gone. The stage had collapsed. And the auditor was holding the microphone. Judge Rostova leaned back in her high leather chair, her expression unreadable behind the glare of her spectacles. She had recovered her composure, locking the shock of recognition behind a judicial mask, but the air in the courtroom had shifted irrevocably. It was no longer a routine hearing, it was a hunting ground. Very well, she said, her voice deceptively mild. The court will hear the petitioner's case. Mr. Fletcher, call your witness. But I warn you, counselor, ensure your house is in order before you invite me inside. Fletcher, sweating now despite the air conditioning, tugged at his collar. He looked at Braden, who gave him a sharp, desperate nod. They were committed to the lie, unaware that they were merely loading the gun for their own execution. The petitioners called Dr. Felix Thorne to the stand, Fletcher announced, his voice lacking its earlier bravado. The side door opened, and Dr. Felix Thorne shuffled in. In the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom, he looked even more dissolute than he had in his office. His suit was ill-fitting, the fabric shiny with age, and his hands shook visibly as he placed them on the Bible to be sworn in. He avoided looking at the judge, and he certainly avoided looking at me. He sat in the witness box, a small, damp man who smelled of wintergreen mints and fear. Fletcher walked him through the script. Dr. Thorne, please state your medical qualifications for the court. Thorne cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound. I am a licensed physician in the state of Washington. I have been practicing for 25 years. And did you examine the respondent, Mr. Vance? I did. On November 21st. What was your diagnosis? Thorne took a sip of water, his eyes darting around the room. Mr. Vance suffers from advanced cognitive decline, likely early-stage Alzheimer's. He exhibited severe paranoia, disorientation, and an inability to grasp simple financial concepts. In my professional opinion, he is a danger to his own estate and requires immediate conservatorship. Braden and Sarah watched him intently, nodding along like bobbleheads, trying to sell the narrative with their body language. "Thank you, doctor," Fletcher said, sitting down with a sigh of relief. He thought he had survived. Then David Gentry stood up. He didn't rush. He walked toward the witness stand with the slow, heavy gait of a predator that knows the prey has nowhere to run. He held a single piece of paper in his hand. "Good morning, Dr. Thorne," David said, his voice pleasant, almost friendly. "You stated you are a licensed physician. Are you a neurologist?" Thorne blinked. "No. I am a general practitioner." "I see. Are you a geriatric specialist?" "No." "So, you have no board certification in the specific fields required to diagnose complex dementia?" Thorne bristled slightly. "I have years of experience." "Experience," David repeated, savoring the word. "Let's talk about your experience, Dr. Thorne. Specifically, your experience with the Nevada legal system." Fletcher jumped up. "Objection. Relevance." Judge Rostova didn't even look at him. Overruled. The witness's credibility is the entire basis of this petition. Answer the question. Thorne's face turned a sickly shade of gray. "I don't know what you mean." David consulted the paper in his hand. "Really? You don't recall the civil judgment against you from the Sapphire Sands Casino in Las Vegas for $45,000 in unpaid gambling markers? A judgment that was finalized 2 months ago." Thorne stammered, looking wildly at Braden. That is a private matter." "It is a matter of public record," David corrected him, his voice hardening. "A debt you were unable to pay. In fact, you are currently facing the revocation of your medical license for financial misconduct, are you not?" Thorne was shaking now, sweat beading on his upper lip. "That is, under appeal." David took a step closer, invading the witness's space. "So we have established that you are not a specialist, and you are in desperate financial trouble. Which brings me to my next question. Dr. Thorne, do you know a company called BC Holdings LLC?" The silence in the room was absolute. Braden went rigid in his seat, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the table. Thorne's eyes widened. I might have heard of it." "You might have heard of it," David said, dropping the friendly veneer entirely. "Dr. Thorne, I have here a bank transfer record dated November 23rd. 3 days before you signed this affidavit declaring a sane man incompetent. It shows a wire transfer of $30,000 from BC Holdings LLC directly into your practice's operating account. The memo line says, 'Consulting, tell me, doctor, what kind of medical consulting did you do for Mr. Cole's real estate shell company?'" Thorne opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Braden, pleading for help, but Braden was staring at the table, looking like a man trying to disappear. "Did you consult on the structural integrity of a lie?" David roared, slamming the paper onto the railing of the witness box. "Did you sell your oath for 30 grand to help a con man lock up his father-in-law?" He told me." Thorne cracked. "He dissolved right there on the stand. He told me the old man was sick. He said he just needed the signature to handle the banks. I needed the money. They were going to take my house." The confession spilled out of him in a torrent of pathetic excuses. The courtroom erupted. Fletcher buried his face in his hands. Sarah let out a sob of pure terror. Judge Rostova stood up, her robe billowing like the wings of an avenging angel. "Bailiff," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "Take this man into custody immediately. I am holding him in contempt of court, and I am referring this transcript to the district attorney for immediate charges of perjury and fraud." 2 deputies moved in, pulling a weeping Thorne from the stand and handcuffing him in front of the horrified gallery. The sound of the cuffs ratcheting shut was the only sound in the room. Judge Rostova remained standing, her eyes burning with a cold, furious fire. She turned her gaze slowly from the sobbing doctor to the petitioner's table. She looked at Braden Cole, who was now trembling visibly, sweat soaking through his expensive suit. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Your star witness has just been arrested for criminal conspiracy. Your petition is built on a foundation of perjury and bribery." She leaned over the bench. "Now, would your client, Mr. Cole, like to take the stand to explain his relationship with Dr. Thorne? Or should I just issue a bench warrant right now?" Fletcher looked at Braden. Braden looked at me. For the first time, he saw me. He didn't see the legacy hardware. He saw the man who had audited his life and found him wanting. He saw the trap closing. And in his panic, he made the mistake all narcissists make. He thought he could talk his way out of it. He stood up, shaking off his lawyer's restraining hand. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice cracking. I was trying to protect him. You don't understand. He's confused. He doesn't know what he's doing with his money." David Gentry smiled, a shark sensing blood in the water. He looked at me and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The trap was sprung. Braden had just opened the door to his own finances. He had claimed my financial incompetence was the issue, which meant he had just made his own financial competence relevant. I stood up, smoothing the front of my suit. "Your Honor," I said, my voice calm and authoritative. "The petitioner claims I am mishandling my assets. I believe it is time we examine the assets in question. And more importantly, the assets of the man who claims he can manage them better than I can." I walked toward the projector screen that had been set up for the hearing. "If it pleases the court, I would like to present Exhibit B." The hum of the projector fan was the only sound in the courtroom as I connected my laptop to the court's A/V system. The screen flickered for a moment, a blinding white square against the wood paneling, before settling into the stark, high-contrast resolution of a forensic spreadsheet. It wasn't pretty. It lacked the glossy renderings and lens flare effects of Braden's sales pitches. It was a grid of raw data, a mathematical autopsy of a crime in progress. I turned to face the room, the remote clicker heavy in my hand. Braden Cole sat frozen at the petitioner's table, his face a mask of waxen terror. He knew what was on that hard drive. He knew that for the first time in his life, he wasn't being judged on his potential, but on his arithmetic. And in my world, the math never lies. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady and projecting to the back of the room. "The petitioner has claimed that my refusal to invest in his venture, Ether Tower, was proof of my senility. He claimed it was a golden opportunity that only a confused mind would reject. Let us examine that opportunity." I clicked the remote. The screen filled with a flow chart of capital allocation for Ether Tower LLC. It was a spiderweb of red lines. "This is the financial architecture of the project. You will notice something immediately. There is no construction budget. There is no allocation for materials, labor, or engineering." I used the laser pointer to circle the massive drain at the center of the web. Of the $4 million raised from initial investors, $3.2 million was immediately transferred to a holding company called BC Lifestyle Management. From there, it was used to lease a Bentley, pay for a membership at a private aviation club, and rent the glass mansion the petitioner currently resides in. I looked at Braden. "Ether Tower is not a building, Your Honor. It is a bank account that only accepts deposits and produces nothing but lifestyle expenses for Mr. Cole." Braden jumped to his feet, knocking his chair over. "That's proprietary data. You hacked my servers. This is inadmissible." Judge Rostova stared at him over her glasses, her expression one of cold, simmering fury. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice dropping an octave. You opened the door to your financial competency. Mr. Vance is merely walking through it. And if I were you, I would sit down and remain silent before you add obstruction of justice to your growing list of problems. Braden sank back into his chair, looking like a deflated balloon. His lawyer, Mr. Fletcher, had moved his chair 6 inches away from his client, a physical dissociation that spoke volumes. I clicked the remote again. But the mismanagement of investor funds is merely the appetizer, I continued, relentless. The petitioner needed to cover these losses. He needed fresh capital to pay the dividends to early investors to keep them from asking questions. A classic Ponzi structure. When he ran out of friends to fleece, and when I refused to be his next victim, he turned to a darker source. The screen changed to display the internal ledgers of the Vance Literacy Fund. The room went deadly quiet. Even the bailiff stopped shifting his weight. This, I said, my voice losing its professional detachment and trembling with suppressed rage, is the charitable foundation established by my late wife, Eleanor. Its mission is to provide reading tutors for underprivileged children. It is a sacred trust. I clicked to the next slide. A series of canceled checks appeared, magnified 10 times their normal size. Starting 6 months ago, the fund began making payments to BC Holdings and Serenity Event Planning. These payments total $412,000. I looked at Sarah. She was weeping silently, her hands covering her face, rocking back and forth. There were no events, I said, my eyes fixed on my daughter. There was no consulting. This was looting. Pure and simple. You stole from a dead woman's legacy to pay for a living man's vanity. I clicked the remote one last time, zooming in on the signature line of the check. And you, Sarah, I said softly, the sorrow in my voice echoing off the walls. You signed the checks. You held the door open while he robbed your mother's grave. Sarah broke then. It was a wretched, high-pitched wail that tore through the decorum of the court. He told me it was a loan, she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Braden. He told me he would pay it back when the tower funding closed. He said we would lose the house if I didn't sign. Braden turned on her, his face twisting into a snarl of reptilian self-preservation. Shut up, Sarah. You signed them. It was your account. You're the director. It was a chaotic, ugly scene, the veneer of their perfect marriage dissolving into mutual recrimination and panic. Judge Rostova banged her gavel, but she didn't need to. The silence that followed Braden's outburst was heavy with the weight of confession. He had just admitted to the scheme in open court. He had admitted that the house, the lifestyle, the success, it was all hanging by a thread spun from stolen charity money. I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I said, the petitioner claims I am paranoid about my finances. I submit that I am not paranoid. I am simply the only person in this family who knows how to read a balance sheet. They didn't file this conservatorship because I was losing my mind. They filed it because I was the only thing standing between them and total insolvency. They needed my assets to plug the hole in their fraud before the house of cards collapsed. I walked over to the petitioner's table and placed my hands on the polished wood, leaning in close to Braden. He smelled of sweat and fear, the expensive musk long gone. You called me legacy hardware, Braden, I whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. You said I needed to be phased out. But you forgot one thing about legacy systems. We were built to last. We were built to handle the load. You built your life on the cloud, on vapor and lies. I straightened up and looked at the judge. I didn't lose my mind, Braden. I was just busy counting yours. And I found you short. Judge Rostova looked at the wreckage of the petitioner's case. She looked at the weeping daughter, the cornered son-in-law, and the piles of forensic evidence projecting on the screen. She closed the file folder in front of her. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice filled with a grim respect. "You have made your point. The petition for conservatorship is denied with prejudice." But she looked at Braden, her eyes narrowing. "Given the evidence of fraud and embezzlement presented here, I believe we are far from done." "No, Your Honor," I said, reaching for the second manila folder, the one I had kept sealed until this exact moment. "We are not done. Because while Mr. Cole has confessed to the fraud, he still believes he owns the chair he is sitting in. He believes that even if he goes to prison, he can declare bankruptcy and shield his assets." I turned to Braden, who was looking at me with the eyes of a trapped animal. "You think the banks will protect you, Braden? You think you can negotiate with your creditors?" I opened the folder and pulled out the document with the blue cover. "But you can't negotiate with me." The lawyer Miles Fletcher snatched the document from the table, his eyes scanning the header with the frantic intensity of a man realizing he is standing on a landmine. I watched the color drain from his face, turning him a sickly, parchment white as the reality of the text sank in. He looked up at me, then at Braden, then back at the paper, his hands trembling visibly. This is an assignment of note," Fletcher whispered, his voice cracking. "From Vanguard Shadows Capital Partners. Assigned to the Eleanor Trust." He looked at me with dawn-breaking horror. You bought the paper. You bought the debt." Braden stared at him, uncomprehending. What does that mean?" "Vanguard isn't." "It means," I interrupted, my voice ringing in the silent courtroom with the clarity of a church bell, "that as of 4 a.m. this morning, I am the sole holder of the promissory note for Ether Tower LLC. I own the debt, the liens, and the personal guarantees." I turned to Braden, whose mouth was opening and closing like a fish on a dock. "You see, Braden, you made a calculation error. You thought your biggest problem was the conservatorship. You thought if you could just lock me away, you could use my assets to pay off Marcus Sterling and keep your house of cards standing. But you didn't ask Marcus who he learned the trade from. You didn't know that 20 years ago, I audited the firm that gave him his start. I took a step closer, letting the shadow of my presence fall over him. You defaulted on your loan yesterday, Braden. The grace period expired at midnight. And unlike Vanguard Shadows, I have no interest in renegotiating terms. I am exercising the acceleration clause. The full principal of $8.4 million is due immediately." You can't do that," Braden wheezed, looking around the room as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. It's family. You can't just call the loan. I need time. I have investors lined up. The Saudis are coming in next week." "There are no Saudis, Braden." I snapped, the sudden volume making him flinch physically. "There is no tower. There is no crypto. There is only a mud pit in Soto and a mountain of debt that you tried to bury under my name." I turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is not a negotiation. This is a foreclosure. The respondent, myself, is the secured creditor for every asset the petitioner owns. His home, his vehicles, his shell companies, they are all cross-collateralized against this note." I looked back at Braden, my eyes cold and hard. "You wanted my money. You have it. You have $8 million of it. And now, I want my collateral." Fletcher tried to intervene, his voice weak and wavering. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. My client is under extreme duress. We need a recess to review these documents. We need time to structure a payment plan." Judge Rostova looked at the assignment of note, then at Braden, her expression one of grim finality. "Mr. Fletcher, The document appears to be a standard commercial instrument. Your client signed it. He personally guaranteed it. And he is currently in default. She leaned back in her chair. If Mr. Vance is the holder of the note, he has every right to enforce it. And considering your client just admitted to embezzlement in my courtroom, I am not inclined to grant a recess for him to hide more assets. She looked at me, her gaze steady. Mr. Vance, you may proceed. I turned to Sarah. She was sitting in the ruins of her life, tears streaming down her face, looking for me to Braden with a dawning realization of total catastrophe. Sarah, I said quietly, the sorrow in my chest threatening to choke me, but I pushed it down. You wanted to secure the legacy. Well, the legacy is secure. The Eleanor Trust now owns the house you live in. It owns the Range Rover you drove here. It owns the furniture, the art, and the silverware. Her eyes went wide with panic. Dad, please, where will we go? We can't, we have nowhere. I don't know, I said, and for the first time, I felt the absolute truth of it. But you can't go home. Because I'm changing the locks at noon. The brutality of it hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. It wasn't revenge, it was accounting. They had tried to steal my life, so I had repossessed theirs. Braden finally cracked. The arrogance, the veneer of the tech visionary, the swagger, it all dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, sobbing child. He lunged across the table, grabbing my sleeve, his fingers digging into the fabric. Arthur. Arthur, please. You can't do this. I'll pay you back. I swear. Just give me 6 months. I can fix this. I'm your son. I looked down at his hand gripping my suit fabric, the expensive charcoal wool of the auditor. I reached out and slowly, deliberately peeled his fingers off my arm, one by one. No, Braden, I said, my voice devoid of anger, leaving only a vast, empty disappointment. You're not my son. You're a bad investment. And I am writing you off. I turned my back on him. I walked over to the bailiff and handed him a separate envelope. This is a copy of the foreclosure notice and the eviction order, effective immediately upon the court's adjournment. I looked at Judge Rostova. Thank you, Your Honor. The defense rests. The courtroom was dead silent as I packed up my laptop. David Gentry gave me a nod, a silent salute to a job finished with surgical precision. Behind me, I could hear Braden sobbing, a jagged, ugly sound of total defeat. Fletcher was frantically whispering into his phone, likely trying to save his own license from the fallout. Sarah was just staring at the wall, catatonic. I walked out of the courtroom and into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air smelled of floor wax and justice. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel happy. I felt heavy, carrying the weight of the family I had just dismantled. But as I walked toward the elevators, I checked my watch. It was 11:45 a.m. The locksmith was meeting me at the glass mansion in 15 minutes. I had a house to secure. I had a charity to rebuild. And for the first time in a decade, the books were finally, perfectly balanced. The legacy hardware had done what it was built to do. It had processed the error and terminated the program. The sentencing of Braden Cole was not a media spectacle. It was a procedural formality, as dry and inevitable as a tax audit. He had tried to fight, of course, hiring a new legal team with money he didn't have, attempting to paint himself as a victim of predatory lending and familial entrapment. But the evidence I had compiled was a fortress with no doors. The forensic trail of the wire transfers, the perjured medical affidavits, and the blatant Ponzi structure of Ether Tower left no room for doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Braden was found guilty on 14 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and aggravated elder abuse. He stood before the judge, not Rostova this time, but a federal judge who had no patience for visionaries who stole from the elderly, and wept as the sentence was read. 12 years in a federal penitentiary. No parole. I watched from the back of the courtroom, my face impassive. I felt no joy, no surge of triumph. I simply felt the satisfaction of a column of figures finally summing to zero. The liability had been removed from the balance sheet. Sarah's fate was more complex, a negotiated settlement between the law and the remnants of my paternal affection. She pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of reckless mishandling of charitable funds to avoid a prison sentence, but the terms of her probation were strict. I insisted on a specific condition, one that the court, seeing the poetic justice in it, readily agreed to. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 3,000 hours of community service. But she wouldn't be picking up trash on the highway or filing papers in a clerk's office. She was assigned to the Vance Literacy Fund. She would not sit on the board. She would not sign checks. She would spend her weekends scrubbing the floors, sanitizing the desks, and organizing the book donations in the basement. She would clean the institution she had tried to loot. I wanted her to smell the lemon polish and the old paper. I wanted her to see the faces of the children she had stolen from. It was a harsh lesson, perhaps, but necessary. She had spent her life believing she was above the consequences of her actions. Now, she would kneel before them with a scrub brush in her hand. 6 months after the trial, I drove to the glass mansion one last time. It was empty now, the staging furniture removed, the echo of Braden's false promises scrubbed from the walls. I had sold it to a quiet software engineer from Microsoft who actually had the funds to pay for it. The proceeds from the sale, along with the liquidation of Braden's luxury cars and the seizure of his hidden crypto wallets, were substantial. I didn't keep a dime. I transferred the entire sum back into the Vance Literacy Fund, restoring the principal she had stolen and adding enough to open 3 new centers in the South Sound. I walked through the empty rooms, the sound of my footsteps reflecting off the glass. It was a cold house, a house built for display, not for living. I stopped in the dining room where Braden had toasted to my obsolescence. Legacy hardware, he had called me. He had been right about one thing: old hardware is heavy, it is difficult to move, and it is built to survive a crash. He was a sleek, modern app that had glitched and crashed. I was the mainframe that was still running. I found Sarah in the basement of the Literacy Center the following Saturday. She was wearing a gray jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her hands red and chapped from the bleach water. She was scrubbing a graffiti tag off a locker. She didn't see me at first. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dull, stripped of the entitlement that had defined her for so long. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just looked tired. "Why?" she asked, her voice rasping in the quiet room. "You could have just said no, Dad. You could have just refused the loan. Why did you have to destroy us? Why did you have to take everything?" I walked over to a shelf and straightened a row of children's books. "I didn't destroy you, Sarah," I said gently. "You were already destroyed. You were drowning in debt and lies long before you asked me for money. If I had just said no, you would have found another victim. You would have stolen more. You would have dragged this out until you were both in prison for 20 years instead of 12. I turned to face her. "I didn't take everything. I took the things that weren't yours. The house, the cars, the status, they were all rented with stolen money. I just returned them to their rightful owners." I looked at her, seeing the ghost of the little girl I had raised, buried deep beneath layers of greed and fear. "You have a chance now, Sarah. It's a hard road, but it's real. For the first time in your adult life, you are earning your existence. Scrubbing these floors is more honorable than anything you did in that glass house. She looked down at the bucket of soapy water, a single tear falling into the gray liquid. "I hate you," she whispered. "I know," I said. "But the books balance. And one day, you might understand that that is a form of love." I left her there and drove to the cemetery. The rain had returned, a soft, steady Seattle drizzle that misted the windshield. I walked to Eleanor's grave, the grass vibrant green against the gray granite. I placed a single white rose on the marker. "It's done, Belle," I said to the wind. "The fund is safe. The children are safe. Sarah is. Sarah is learning." I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence. I was 73 years old. I lived alone in a paid-off house with a paid-off car. I wore cardigans and solved crosswords in pen. The world looked at me and saw a relic, a piece of obsolete technology waiting to be recycled. They didn't see the processing power humming beneath the surface. They didn't understand that the old ways, integrity, diligence, accountability, were not bugs, they were features. My name is Arthur Vance. They used to call me the auditor. I have retired my badge, but I have not retired my principles. This ordeal taught me that evil is not always a monster in the dark. Sometimes it is a smiling relative with a loan application. It taught me that silence is not weakness, and patience is not surrender. And most of all, it taught me that no matter how sophisticated the fraud, no matter how shiny the lie, eventually, someone has to check the math. I am that someone. The ledger is closed. The debt is paid. What would you have done? Would you have bailed them out, or would you have let the gavel fall? Let me know in the comments below. And please, like and subscribe if you believe that in a world of crypto scams and influencers, character is the only currency that never loses its value.